Hello and welcome to The World with me, Yalda.
And me, Richard Engel.
Richard, it's so extraordinary. We're here on this rooftop. It's early morning in the Syrian capital, Damascus. The sun has just risen and it feels on some level like it is a new dawn here in Syria after the toppling of Bashar al-Assad's regime just a few days ago.
This is a special show, and yes, we're outside. We're in this extraordinary place at this extraordinary time. So you might hear a little ambient noise. You might hear some gunshots because there are still a lot going on here, uncertain times. And we're going to talk about what happened here, these several extraordinary days that saw Bashar al-Assad's regime toppled, a rebel advance. Who are these rebels? Where is this all going? And of course, thank you all for listening. Keep tuning in. Keep watching us on YouTube. And if you have any questions, please write in to theworld@sky.uk. And in the background, I think you can hear a little bit of gunshot right now.
There are a lot of men with guns spread out throughout the city.
Some of it's celebratory. We've seen some of the rebels, because there's a curfew imposed here, firing guns in the air to try and clear the streets. So some of it's celebratory, some of these are warning shots, but these are uncertain times. So let's get started.
Let's get started. So Richard, you have spent years reporting from Syria. You were kidnapped in Syria. You have spent time moving around with different rebel groups.
I was a terrorist, according to the previous government here. I was not allowed to come into Syria. I never thought that I was going to be back so soon, but I didn't think I would be coming back to Syria, perhaps in my own lifetime, because Bashar al-Assad won the civil war. He was winning until he lost. It's like the expression, somebody described it as like, alive, 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 dead, like a banks, like Lehman Brothers. It's solvent, broke.
And I wonder though, Richard, did he win or was he just surviving? I mean, I guess that's the question, right? And we've seen this in other places. You saw the way the Taliban were able to just move so quickly within a week or two in Afghanistan, province after province collapsing. Very similar events here. Within 10 days, the rebels moved from northwestern Syria. They captured Aleppo, then they moved down to Hama, Homs, and then suddenly we all woke up on Sunday morning. You and I were in Doha, in Qatar, when the news sort of emerged that the rebels have arrived here in Damascus. Where is Bashar al-Assad? He's fled.
Yeah, so it was a strange journey to get here. We were together in Doha. I left and I was on my way to Turkey. On the flight, got word that Bashar al-Assad was gone. His whereabouts were still unknown. Landed in Turkey, didn't leave the airport, flew to Beirut.
Because you were hoping to go from the northwest.
I thought we would be following the rebels down as they reached the capital, Damascus. I thought we'd be kind of trailing them from behind and then coming in after they had taken the capital. Even then, it looked like he was going to go. Instead, he just went suddenly, rapidly, disappeared. So flew to Lebanon and then crossed the border.
From Beirut.
From Beirut, and it's an hour and a half. It's nothing to cross from Beirut to here.
Tell me about that, actually, because I came in the last 24 hours or so, and the traffic was flowing. It was quite easy to go past the checkpoint. I mean, there was a sense from a lot of Syrians that, my gosh, we're going back home finally. Just tell me what you were seeing when you first came in.
So we'll start from the beginning, right? Let people understand how this has transpired over these last exceptional several days. So I arrived in Beirut as Bashar al-Assad was falling. It wasn't quite sure where he was still at this stage, but it was clear that he wasn't here and in charge anymore. Got to the Lebanese border. Didn't know what we were going to find at the Lebanese border. There were a few security guards there. They kind of just waved us through. Got onto the Syrian side. You know what it's like to cross a land border. There's there's one countryside, Lebanese side, then there's a no man's land in between, like a kind of a militarized zone. Then you get to the Syrian border, and on the Syrian side of this land border, there was nobody there. There were just a couple of rebels, though I say no one from the government. There were a couple of rebels flashing victory signs, the V, the famous V with their fingers, smiling, waved us through, didn't even ask us to roll down the window, just waved us through, and suddenly we were back in Syria, and then an hour later we were in Damascus, and on the road in we saw abandoned government tanks, we saw kids climbing on top of the tanks. We slowed down to kind of roll down the window to look at them and shout out something to them. We were anxious to get to Damascus. And they said, Hurriya, Hurriya, Arabic for freedom, freedom. People were smashing posters of Bashar al-Assad. They were smashing posters of his father, the previous dictator, Hafiz al-Assad. Together, this family dynasty ruled this country with an iron fist for over half a century. And then we rolled into Damascus and went right to the main square, right down the street from where we are.
Yeah, I mean, I think what was striking for me coming in, Richard, was those defaced and torn down posters of Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad. Never would you have been able to imagine. I got out of the car and I spoke to some of those rebels and I said to them, you know, what are you thinking? Who's running this place? Who are you taking orders from? And they said, no, we're here on a humanitarian mission. We're welcoming the Syrians who are leaving Syria and returning back to their country after more than a decade of being in exile, living as refugees in squalid conditions and in misery. But never did they imagine. I mean, there was one poster, Richard, that they had run over with a car. And they said they almost wanted to take revenge from the posters themselves. And there was a man hitting the poster with his shoe. And he said, this is the least we can do for what he did to us, for how he brutalized us. And the sense that you get being in Damascus is almost like a young woman yesterday described it to me. She said, it's like Assad had his boot on our chests. We couldn't breathe. That's been lifted. We can breathe again. We can talk. The basic human right of being able to talk.
They have that. And this was a dictatorship. He was thought of as the sort of dictator light initially when he first came into power and took over from his father.
He wasn't actually supposed to take over, was he?
Supposed to be his older brother who died in a car accident.
Correct, but then he was a doctor and he married this Syrian British woman.
Very glamorous, very beautiful, sophisticated. She was sort of a darling of the media. Was she on the cover of Vogue?
She was on the cover of Vogue just a couple of months before the crackdown began. She was described as the desert rose, or the rose of the desert. They had to quickly
that didn't hold up too well.
remove those those magazines from news agencies across the United States.
They pulled them from the shelves?
They pulled them because suddenly we were seeing this brutal crackdown of these protesters.
And that's what happened. So he came in, there was hope that, okay, maybe he'd be different from his father. He'd be, a strong man, but with a heart and sophistication. His British education would somehow, change him. And initially, he did have a bit of an opening. And the first few months were better than his father had been. And there was a sense that, okay, maybe he will be different. Then the Arab Spring happened. And there were revolutions in Tunisia, revolutions in Egypt, and in Libya, and one started here. And in here, that's when everything changed. He started a crackdown. The rebels became an enemy. This became a mortal, a fight for survival. And that's when the mass arrests began. He started to use chemical weapons against his own people. And it became one of the most savage crackdowns that descended into a decade plus of civil war that left hundreds of thousands of people. I'm not sure people know that. Hundreds of thousands of people died in this country. So when you walk around Damascus now, and I've spent the last several days, as you have been walking around this city, there is a sense of relief. Bashar al-Assad, this bastard, is gone
And
the civil war is over. But what's coming next?
yeah, and we'll get to the what's coming next, but you suddenly realize, I mean, we'd heard reports and stories of his brutality, the way that he would literally crush, have machines that crush people in prisons.
I saw one yesterday.
Absolutely. And the fact that he had this like deep labyrinth of cells deep underground under the prisons where he would virtually bury people alive. And they were alive. Even to this day, they're calling out for help. And the rebels who have gone into these prisons and family members can't actually, they don't know where to find these people in the tunnels because they're buried deep. People were forced to be disappeared. People went missing. People were buried alive. People were tortured, crushed to death, brutalized. This regime, as you say, may have started as dictatorship light, but it went on to be incredibly
It went dark.
brutal. I mean, thousands. There is perhaps no family in Syria that is not impacted by this conflict. Either family members who have been killed or people who have been dragged away simply for standing at a demonstration, simply for appearing to be a voice that is anti-Assad regime. And as you say, they had this brutal crackdown for over 5 decades. Just going into the streets yesterday, it's extraordinary how many people, and you would have experienced this too, how many people were just coming up to me, grabbing me and saying, I want to tell you my story. I want to tell you what I've been through. Yeah.
And there's not a lot of destruction in this city. People think, oh, there was a rebel takeover, the city must be in ruins. I mean, look at it. We're looking at Damascus right now. There are no bullet holes. The war never really came to Damascus. The takeover was, well, there's an explosion.
Yeah.
But the takeover was not peaceful, but smooth, rapid. The government just melted away. You don't see the remnants of war, you just see it on the people's faces.
People are not just happy that they have freedom, but also coming to terms with the dark reality. You know, on the point of the military, Assad's forces melting away. Again, another explosion. There is, you know, after those first few days of celebration, you realize that, you know, there are, I mean, it feels like things are starting to shift and change, you know. But just on the point of Assad's forces suddenly melting away, when you're propped up by foreign elements, Hezbollah, Iran, Russia, funding, backing, propping up your military, not fighting for a real cause, fighting for a corrupt, brutal dictatorship. Suddenly you do melt away because the Russians...
Because there was no there.
Exactly. We were in Doha over the weekend, and I met with the Qatari Prime Minister, who had just spoken to the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, the Iranian Foreign Minister. He'd spoken to the Saudi Foreign Minister and a bunch of others, Jordanian Foreign Minister. And he said to me, you know, we have now come to terms with the fact that these rebels are going to take over. This was just 12 hours before Damascus fell. And the Russians, the Iranians have said, we don't want our bases targeted. We want our personnel. We're not going to prop this guy up. We are engaged elsewhere. So thank you. We helped you, but we're not going to be here for you
And
anymore.
Without that help from the outside, there was nothing left.
Except for a ticket to Moscow.
A ticket to Moscow, granted for political asylum. Humanitarian reasons, even worse, even more revolting. Him and the Desert Rose.
Exactly, off they went to Moscow.
Off they went, leaving behind their luxury cars and a trail of misery and secret prisons.
So, Richard, I guess the big question now is, what's going to happen next? Because, as you say, the main rebel group that has taken over, HTS,
who are these people?
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
Everyone keeps asking me, who are these people?
Yeah, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, led by Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. He's 42, 43-year-old young guy, born in Saudi Arabia.
Pretty charismatic, good-looking, carries himself well.
Actually, originally from Syria, grew up here in Damascus. Our team, actually, my producer, Zain Jafar, came across him yesterday, very randomly.
Yeah, we've been asking for an interview with him, and you doorstopped him and got him. We're preaching out to his people. We want an interview. Come on. And then I said, Sky News just got an interview with him. How did that happen?
How did that even happen? Well, I'll tell you how it happened. So Zain, our international editor, was floating around Damascus, driving around, trying to coordinate all the different teams. And he said as he was driving along, he said he saw a convoy of about 8 cars, and one sort of sped up and pulled up in front of him, and he thought, oh no, I'm going to get kidnapped again. He's been in this situation himself. What's going on? And he said suddenly, all these men emerged from the vehicle, and there I saw Jolani emerge from one of the cars.
It was his security detail.
It was his security detail. And he said he had about 8 pretty tough security rebels with him.
But what's amazing, he didn't just say back off and said let them go by when these hard boys got out of the car.
Not at all. He jumped out of the car. The team who were with him jumped out, and he followed. And these blasts are quite loud.
It was like this a couple of days ago when the Israelis were bombing. I don't think that's what this is right now. But
yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of rumors swirling that the Israeli tanks are sort of closing in. But the Israelis have denied that.
You do now hear random gunfire and explosions that is not always
getting
clear.
Quite loud, that explosion. But just on the story
we'll find out
what that is. But Jolani, so Zain sort of followed him, sort of chased after him, and he said, we started to film with one of our phones, and he said, I went to ask him a question. He said something about, what's your message to
Jolani.
what's your message to the international
I'm saying that's
community?
pretty cool that he's just like, oh, by the way, since I'm not being kidnapped right now, I have an idea. Let's do an interview.
Exactly. But also, this is a man who has a $10 million bounty on his head. This is a man that is
He was an Al-Qaeda leader.
One of Al-Qaeda's top leaders. The United States has his group and himself on a terror watch list. Suddenly, he's floating around Damascus. This man in the shadows who was leading this rebel group suddenly appears at the mosque, his childhood mosque here in Damascus. He re-emerges.
So a small mosque.
A small mosque in one of the suburbs.
Not the big Umayyad mosque and one of the historic ones.
50 people were at this sermon, and he said the sheikh introduced him not as Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, which is quite interesting. He introduced him not by his nom de guerre, his guerrilla rebel name. They introduced him to the 50 people at this sermon as Ahmed al-Shara, which is his original real name. Again, this is a clever guy who's got a very colorful CV. He went from being part of ISIS in Iraq and then forming Al-Qaeda here in Syria, the Al-Nusra Front, and a branch of ISIS that then is also Al-Qaeda. He sort of denounced ISIS because he thought they were too brutal. But he sort of invited Zain into the mosque and said, this is a big question. What's my response to the international community? Come and listen to the sermon. Zain said he was incredibly charismatic, that he has presence. You can tell that he is a leader and that people are listening to him.
So Zain went in, listened to the sermon.
And then put some questions to him and said to him, what message do you have for the international community? You have nothing to fear. The people that we have overthrown, Bashar al-Assad, Hezbollah, Iran's grip, these are the groups that you should fear. We are here, we are Syrians first, and we want a Syria for all Syrians.
And he's saying all the right things. Can he be believed is another question. And initially, Syrians want to believe him because they went through such a horrible experience. I've seen a couple of these rapid transfers of power, and they go through phases. I was in Baghdad when Saddam Hussein was suddenly overthrown in Iraq in 2003, and there were similar images of defacing the statues and defacing the posters and hitting the statues with shoes to punish the man through his effigy. And initially there's this excitement because the regime was so awful, and then very quickly there starts to be expectations and frustration that sets in. In Baghdad, it was like, well, where's the power? And what's going on? And why can't you people organize things? And we want this, and we want that, and we want X, Y, and Z. We want justice from the past. I was in Ukraine when Yanukovych was overthrown, and in Libya when Gaddafi was overthrown, and I can't even remember them all. But this has happened a few times. Each time it does, it's extraordinary. And on the first day, there was this excitement. Day one, celebrations, jubilation, firing in the air, freedom, we've got it, we can taste it, hurriya, we've got it. Day 2, day of exploration. They broke into the prisons. They're looking for documents. They're looking for their loved ones.
Not a lot of looting, I must say.
Not much.
Although they were taking the chairs from the palace.
Some, but looting from public buildings, looting from the palaces, but not breaking into people's homes.
Which, by the way, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, this rebel leader,
he put a red line on that.
Not one bullet is to be fired, although we are hearing, but
Yeah,
not
not
at
one bullet,
civilians.
not shoot them up, not into people.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then after that, he's even said, don't fire up in the air anymore. So he's saying the right things. He's saying what people want to hear. He's saying that women's rights are going to be protected, that this is going to be a country open for all Syrians of all different religions and ethnic groups, whether he can be believed or not, we'll get to in a second. But on this day of discovery, and I think we're still in that period right now, they're realizing the horrors that they went through. They're going into this secret prison. You mentioned this crush. So the Saidnaya prison was this torture dungeon, similar to perhaps Abu Ghraib.
Described as a slaughterhouse.
It was described by Amnesty International as a human slaughterhouse. And I went in there, and there were thousands of people, families, looking for their relatives. They were looking for signs of life, that the prison had already been liberated. The rebels had already broken into the cells and let people out. But
Some people were so terrified. They'd been in the dark for so long.
they could barely walk. Some people, I saw them, they'd kind of lost their mind.
Yeah,
they
they
didn't
were
even
too
know who
afraid
they were.
they couldn't remember their names.
Just horrendous conditions. And I can understand why. This was a slaughterhouse. It was an execution house. It was a death camp. So these families were there. They knew that the prison officially had been emptied and the cells were empty, but they thought maybe there was some underground cell. So they came with sledgehammers and pickaxes, and there were a couple of bulldozers, and they were breaking into the walls and breaking into the floors, desperately looking for loved ones who were hidden in some subterranean lair. We didn't see any evidence that there is one, but what we did see were all these torture devices. And one was this press, the crusher. It was a hydraulic press, and prisoners would be put into it and then squeezed. There was a medieval torture that was similar to this, where they would put increasingly heavy stones on top of you until your rib cage more or less collapsed. Then we saw nooses. Some still had blood on them. This was a facility that was being used for execution on a massive scale, just until recently. The blood was still wet on these nooses.
There were people who were killed 24 hours before Assad actually fled. They were killing right to the very end.
I thought about those people. Can you imagine? You're in there, the rebels are on the doorstep of the city, and you're being executed that day. What kind of human being does that? Carries out that execution?
Knowing it's all over.
You know, you look at your watch, we've got one more day or two more days, we're going to do it anyway. You got to rot in hell for that.
I mean, it's horrific. There were, I saw images yesterday from one of the reports that we did of mothers just with fresh body bags of their dead sons, saying, I haven't seen my son in over a decade, and now I find his body bag still smelling of death.
Brutal until the last second, and then gone. I saw uniforms. You walk around the streets, you see uniforms that soldiers just took off, dropped on the streets, and then they ran. They're either hiding or they left the country, but they didn't stay and fight. But they were executing people
right
to
the
last
end.
second.
And I guess that's the big question, isn't it, Richard? That what do these rebel groups? First of all, this is not the victory of, while there is one big overarching rebel group, and Jolani has led that into Damascus, but there are still small rebel groups who were part of mobilizing and taking over this country. And those rebel groups are backed and sponsored by different international actors. And that is where things could get potentially tricky, because they are being funded and they're going to want their own share of the pie. Even though Jolani has said we're going to form this interim government, they went
government of national salvation.
And they went and got Assad's prime minister. My gosh, what is happening over there?
Yeah,
it's a lot of
that's
outgoing.
a heavy machine gun.
Yeah.
Welcome back to Damascus.
I mean, people rested in this city for a couple of days of just respite, and now there's uncertainty. I mean, what is happening?
This could go wrong very quickly. As I was saying, when
gentleman over there is just peering through the window. I mean, just this sense of...
Yeah, he's looking around as we are saying,
what
is that?
What is happening? You can see people opening their curtains, just when they were taking a breath.
Because they were saying, maybe we've done it. Maybe we've come out of the frying pan, but have we just fallen into the fire now?
But you drive around town and you wonder, all these different little checkpoints, who is your leader? Who is running this place? Who are you taking orders from? Is it Jolani? Is it some other group? In the night, suddenly there's a checkpoint that emerges. Who are you reporting to? And we know the murkiness of, the last 14 years. There are different elements and groups across this country, including ISIS.
So this was a bath party country, right? This was a secular dictatorship that got more and more brutal as the years went by. But it was like Saddam Hussein's Iraq. It was a secular country. You could drink. Women, they didn't have an issue with women. They had lots of other issues, basically with freedom. But it wasn't the Taliban. It wasn't misogynistic. They hated everybody. Men and women just don't oppose the government. Otherwise, you're gonna die. But it wasn't an Islamist government. These people who have come in with a leader who's now...
Describe their stronghold of Idlib in the northwest.
So these people who have come in, yes, al-Jolani was a part of Al-Qaeda. He was a big fish in the organization. He came here, he formed a faction of Al-Qaeda called the Nusra Front, and they fought against ISIS. They hated ISIS because they were Islamist rivals. They had different interpretations of what it should be, but mostly it was a fight over power, who could claim the mantle.
Even though he was, his
Islam.
Mentor was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS.
But then they split.
broke off.
They broke off. As often is the case, you end up hating the person who's sort of most similar to you and your rival. And then he rebranded himself several years ago and said, we are now Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which means the organization for the liberation of Sham is like the Levant, the greater Syria region, Syria, Lebanon, this part of the world. And they are trying to sort of now claim that they're different, that they're going to be open to everyone. But for the last several years, during the Civil War, they were ruling in a province called Idlib. So we do have a sense already of how they did govern in this small area that they held. And it was not...
They're Islamists.
They're Islamists. So women were in black, in loose-fitting clothing. If you killed someone, you were killed. If you stole, you had corporal punishment against you. Islamic law, let's call them democratic ideology, that they're not exactly talking about ideology, but it was not necessarily all that they're claiming that they're going to bring here.
Jolani in 2021, after the Taliban takeover, praises the Taliban for the way in which they entered the city and took over the country. But interestingly, in the last few days, the group has also issued a statement saying, it is not our duty and it is against Islam to tell women how to dress. Even asking them to dress modestly is something that we are not going to do. It will be interesting, though.
Yeah, we'll see if he does it. So, because in Idlib, that wasn't the case. In Idlib, women were dressed, encouraged, let's say, to dress modestly. But now, maybe he is adapting. The group is pragmatic. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt for a second, and then we can say, well, it's easy to be pessimistic. Oh, they're a bunch of extremists, and let's talk both sides. So, benefit of the doubt. They learned the lesson from the Taliban. People here are nervous, but they have no choice but to try and give them a shot. They are being recognized by Arab states, and people are coming into this country, unlike in
where
Kabul.
They were fleeing.
Kabul fell. The Taliban arrived. And people were so terrified, they were hanging on to the bottom of a plane, so desperate to get out that they thought that they could fly, and no one was coming into the country. Here, thousands upon thousands of people are coming back. So there are segments of society here that want to give them a chance, that
And
want
they
a new chapter, and want to believe all of the things that he's saying.
And as you say, they've learned their lesson, and there is a maturity about the way in which they're operating. That they have sort of realized the wrongs of the past, and Jolani, as you say, has rebranded himself.
They're not the Taliban.
It'll be interesting, as you say, whether they are going to try and impose Sharia law across this country. Someone asked me the other day, a journalist who hasn't arrived here in Damascus, and said, you used to be able to get a beer in Damascus. Is that something you can still do?
You still can today.
I wonder if you can do that in a few weeks' time.
Or a few months, or a few years. Let's talk about the regional.
Israel,
let's talk about Israel. Let's talk about the regional dynamic here right now, because they rolled into power. The government faded away. This moment of exploration and uncertainty is going on now, and there's some random gunfire and explosions that you do hear in parts of the city, but it's not necessarily a menacing place. It doesn't feel like you're going to go out into the streets and someone's just going to come and shoot you or kidnap you. But there is still uncertainty. The rebels are still searching for elements of the former regime. So you could see fights emerging because they're looking for certain who they consider war criminals. But the Israelis don't trust them at all. So what the Israelis are doing is creating a buffer zone. They're moving in the Golan Heights. They're taking former positions of the Syrian government, and they're destroying heavy weapons. They've destroyed the Syrian Navy. They're destroying long-range rockets and missiles. They're destroying air defenses. So they're leaving chemical weapons factories. So they're leaving this country unarmed in a way that it can't project power and threaten its neighbors.
The Israelis I've spoken to have said to me, we're worried, we're cautiously pessimistic about the situation. When this mobilization by the rebels was taking place, I got in touch with some people within the security establishment of Israel, and they said, look, we welcome bad guys killing bad guys. If these rebels want to kill and target Assad regime and overthrow this brutal dictatorship that is propped up by their arch rival and enemy Iran, fine, do that. Kill them, attack them, overthrow them. But don't think that we are not concerned for the Israelis. This began on October the 7th. Of course, if you look at the sort of sequence of events, Hamas attacks Israel, takes 200 plus hostages, kills 1,200 people. Hezbollah gets involved in the fight. Iran gets engaged in that. Of course, Russia is engaged in Ukraine. So the groups that were backing and supporting, including Hezbollah fighters here in Syria, supporting and fighting alongside Syrian forces, and they got a really bad rap and reputation as a result of that. Hassan Nasrallah was almost across the Arab world criticized for sending Hezbollah forces to fight alongside Assad. Suddenly, all that disappears and melts away. So for Israel, they don't trust these rebel groups, but their primary thing is, you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. So they've moved into Syrian territory.
But they're not leaving them alone.
Not for now. As in, we are going to do what we need to do to ensure that we don't have an October 7, which is the reason they're justifying
no capacity to carry out an attack
on us. And they've made that very clear, that we don't want to have an enemy on our doorstep that could potentially become a problem for us. Different rebel groups, Islamists, the reemergence of ISIS, here with chemical weapons factories, arms, a naval fleet that could become a direct threat to Israel. So you've got the Israel element, and by the way, they're being supported by the United States, the UK, for what they're doing at the moment. So they haven't said exactly how many, but they have launched hundreds of airstrikes on different military facilities at the moment.
Should we take a question? I think
absolutely.
there's a question from Judy Alexander from San Diego, California. And she starts off by saying, I'm learning so much, interesting and informative. She likes the podcast, which is great. The last few days, it appears that factions and countries are cannibalizing different parts of Syria. How do you imagine the country that was Syria will look in the near future? And what is going to happen with the United States interests, oil, and whatever in the area? So we've already talked about what Israel is doing. Israel is moving in to disarm this country, weaken it, so that whatever happens here, it is not an international threat. But as you said, the Israelis are not the only actors here. During the course of the civil war, the Kurds carved out their own faction. They have their own mini state called Rojava, which is backed by US forces.
In northeastern
Syria. That is where most of the oil is in this country. There are US troops based there. They are on a counter-ISIS mission. They work with the Kurds. So you have a part of the country that is effectively out of Syria's control. It is run by the Americans and run by the Kurds, and they fight against ISIS, and they have all the oil. So what's going to happen to them? Are they going to be kicked out? Is HTS going to go to war against them? By the way, that will be a tough war because they're backed by US elite special forces.
I mean, for now, Richard, because we know that Donald Trump, president-elect, is just weeks away from coming into office. And I remember in 2019, I think it was maybe October or November, when Donald Trump said, we're pulling out all the US forces from northeastern Syria. Not our problem. Even though the Kurds had fought shoulder to shoulder with the United States, led that fight against the so-called Islamic State, that gunfire is quite extraordinary, actually, that it's just playing out. I mean, early morning here in Damascus, and for the last hour or so that we've been up here, that has been consistently
well, when we're done,
we'll have to try and figure out. I mean, they always say about journalists.
Why don't you go? You go first.
You go first.
Okay, I'll call your car. You go first. You tell me how it's going.
But you know, it's clearly quite close. We can hear it. It's been consistently taking place at loud booms
we'll
and
check
gunshots.
it out. We'll check it out when we're done.
But just on northeastern Syria, as you say, 900 or so U.S. troops based there. We don't know how Donald Trump's going to react.
These are the troops that killed Baghdadi, the former ISIS leader, and the sort of the cream of the crop. Very, very, very tough American troops there working with the Kurds, who are also excellent fighters.
And by the way, a number of many ISIS fighters held in prisons that the Kurds are looking after.
So as you were saying, Trump almost abandoned them once. It caused a disruption in his government, and ultimately Trump changed his mind and said, fine, well, leave those troops there. Is he going to pull them out? If he pulls those troops out again, it's very likely that the Kurds in that part of the country are going to face enormous challenges. They're going to have to work out some sort of deal with the HTS. And by the way, my understanding from my reporting and context is that deal is already underway. The Kurds are already talking to HTS so that they can work out some sort of formulation. Hey, let's work together. We have oil in our territory. We have our backers from the American troops, so we're pretty strong. Don't just think you can, push us around.
Come in here, steamroll.
Come steamroll us.
And the question about why HTS or any of these rebel forces would do that, obviously because of Turkey's influence.
Exactly. So there are all these different proxies and power plays underway. Then there's the issue of the minorities here. There are Christians in this community. There are Alawites, who are a Shia faction. Bashar al-Assad himself is Alawite. So if they come in here and impose Islamic law, Sharia law, which is Sunni Sharia law, what happens to the Christians? What happens to the Alawites? By the way, the
Alawites have been the dominant force here.
Who are Muslims, but they're mostly secular. So that could be a tremendously divisive
And Bashar al-Assad was an Alawite, as you say, a sect of Shia Islam, a minority here in this country, dominating the politics for over 5 decades. Suddenly, the Sunni rebels have sort of taken over the city. I was speaking to a young rebel fighter yesterday, 18 years old, and I said to him, you look very young. When did you join the movement? He said a couple of years ago. My father was taken, my uncle was taken, many different family members were taken and disappeared. They were brutalized, they were killed, they were tortured. So this is my revenge. And I said to him, what kind of Syria do you want to see? And he said, Christians, Jews, Alawites, everybody. This is a Syria for all. So the same language as, but he said under the umbrella of Sharia law. So interesting that,
That's a big caveat. We want it to be open for everyone, but under the umbrella of Sharia law. So if you're going to be an optimist, you could say, well, maybe this country's been through so much pain, so much horror, that can bring them together. If you're a pessimist, you can say, these are Islamists who have very clear ideas of how things should be run, what is appropriate, what is not. They marched in victorious. Israel already hates them. There are other countries in the Middle East that are skeptical of Islamists coming into power. The country is divided into sections with Kurds in one area and Shias and Christians in others. So if you want to take the negative point of view, you could see perhaps a return of the civil war here, and I think Syrians don't know which way it's going to go.
And one of the things that I observed yesterday was life feels somewhat like it always does in these places, like people are going out and about, doing their shopping, getting on with their lives.
Banks have reopened.
And also the rebels have said,
Despite this, the banks have reopened.
Exactly. People are going, down to the local malls.
Life is normal back in Damascus. Well, no, it's not. It's this new, weird, transitionary normal.
And where people don't know what is actually going on. I mean, we
And that guy who was looking out the window?
He
just closed his
curtains.
Closed his curtains.
Oh,
He's
well,
probably going back to bed. He's having another
of,
coffee and cigarette. He's like, I'm done for the morning.
Exactly. So there are all of these different things that the Syrian people have to grapple with, including poverty, including coming to terms with missing family members and the torture that this sort of very traumatized nation has gone through. 14 years of civil war, 54 years of Assad regime brutality. It breaks your heart. My impressions yesterday were that some people were walking around looking quite dazed, almost like waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. These are people who have been told by a dictator when to breathe, when to eat, when to sleep, how to live. This is how the people here have felt for decades. They have lived in absolute fear. So
that is a point of strength, because of having this shared collective misery. They can find some solidarity in that. There was no trust, there was absolute fear, and that could help them. But I see it in a larger Middle Eastern context. So Hezbollah is now gone. Who would have imagined that? Hezbollah is now effectively removed. Russia has been weakened in the region, and Putin was humiliated here. Iran is weakened. What used to be described as the Shia crescent has been broken. So the entire fabric of the Middle East within a year is now been torn, folded, resewn, and it is being reshaped. So history is in motion right now in the Middle East, and I think this is going to play out for the next several years. In fact, I think Trump's going to be a major factor if he decides to pull troops out of this country. We got to watch Iraq. Iraq is, in this case, the dog that hasn't barked. It's deeply tied to this conflict, so I'm watching what's happening there across the border. But right now, I think we have enough on our plate to try and figure out what's happening. We don't even know what's going on across town.
No, exactly.
And you're going to go first in a minute and go tell me.
You're going to sacrifice me, Richard. But as you say, who will do your podcast with you every week?
Exactly.
But just on that, there is the situation here in Syria where we're hearing the gunfire, we're hearing the kind of menacing elements, the checkpoints that are emerging, the rebel fighters that have descended on this city, promising that this will be a united, diverse Syria, a Syria for all Syrians. When you look at the map of Syria, you see how divided this nation is. It's torn up into little places. So Whether or not the Syrians want to have control over their own future and whether they'll be allowed to is another question. As we've been talking about for the last year or so, we've been talking about this axis of resistance that Iran had created over decades as well, that they had, backed and funded these militant groups.
It's crumbling.
It's crumbled, from what we've seen. And Iraq is now the only buffer zone for the Iranians. The Iranian empire,
and it's right on their border,
has weakened. All they have now is the Yemeni Houthis and Iraq as a buffer zone. So we heard from the former head of MI6. You and I spoke to him a few weeks ago, where he said,
Sir Alex, yes.
Sir Alex Younger, who said, there's going to be maximum pressure on Iran from the United States and its allies, and we're going to see a lot of compromises from Iran over the course of the next year. Before October 7, if we go back now 14 months, Iran had a noose around Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah. Today, as you say, the Israelis said, don't come anywhere near us, because if you want to fight, we will fight, warning the rebels. And as you say, the rebels themselves are pragmatic. They've already had outreach from the Russians, from the Iranians, obviously in a weaker position, from different Gulf countries as well, and they're going to work with all of these countries.
And different deals are being made. Right here, there's some gunfire going on, but across town at the Four Seasons Hotel, the elite of the rebel movement, the international community, the UN, all kinds of spies and diplomats are having private meetings redrawing the map of the Middle East. It's like we've gone back a century, right after World War I, when the map of the Middle East was initially drawn in hotels and salons across the region and across Europe. It's happening again, and it's happening now in Damascus with deals and with guns.
Absolutely, and as we've seen over the course of the last century, there has been so much bloodshed in this region. And as they try and reshape this region, the hope is that these people can now have a better future, a better life, no more bloodshed, no more brutality. But, as we've said, I'm not sure that is going to happen anytime soon.
It has been fantastic to spend this time with you here in Damascus. Just a few weeks ago, I was saying, I don't think I'm going to be able to come back here. I was a terrorist because I'd spent so much time with the rebels, according to the previous regime. Now the regime is gone, and here we are.
And in this moment, in this tiny, tiny window, a free Syria.
And it could go either way. Wonderful.
Really good to see you again, Richard.
And keep tuning in and watch us on YouTube and listen to us wherever you get your podcasts, and send us more questions. And the email is?
The email is theworld@sky.uk.
All right. Thanks very much.
Richard.
Until next time.
Until next time, see you soon.